Paris, August 25th, 1944. The Americans were triumphantly parading along the Champs-Élysées, greeted as conquering heroes. Ten days later, the British marched through Antwerp, liberating Belgium. Victory was in the air, and celebrations swept the Western Front. But for two nations, there would be no celebrating, and the coming winter would forge a bond between them that would last generations. The 120,000 men and women of the 1st Canadian Army were not in Paris or Antwerp, and had got little of the glories since they landed on D-Day. Instead, they'd been given the grimmest tasks on the Western Front.
We were the foot sloggers. You know, every job was dirty, every job.
Away from the great capitals, the Canadians were fighting street to street, door to door, driving the Germans from the Atlantic coast. 300 kilometers away, Holland thought its liberation was imminent. On Tuesday, September 5th, the joyous Dutch went out into the streets to celebrate. But it was a tragic illusion.
We had what was called Dolle Dinsdag. I think you should translate that as Mad Tuesday. All over the country, people expected to be liberated the same day or maybe the next day.
That was, in fact, the day before my 5th birthday, and people were in a high state of excitement because it was being rumored that the Canadian troops and the British troops were already in Rotterdam and The Hague and so on. Everybody thought the war would be at an end. So it was a day of very considerable excitement. Yes, I remember that.
And the Germans were very, very subdued because they were thinking the same thing and they were actually trying to get away.
And then it didn't happen. Then it was because we showed ourselves so happy that it happened that the Germans were completely, they were in a rage. They were terrible, terrible people.
The fortunes of war would now link the Canadians and the Dutch to a harsh fate. At Allied headquarters, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery has an idea. Instead of liberating Holland, the Allies would gamble everything on a risky scheme to parachute thousands of troops over enemy lines and make a dash for Berlin. This operation, called Market Garden, left the Dutch stranded and the Canadians isolated and undermanned for their next mission.
Eisenhower, I don't think, ever believed in Market Garden much. It was Montgomery's baby. And it did, of course, detract from the clearing of Antwerp.
The Canadians were given the almost hopeless job of clearing the Germans from the approaches to the port of Antwerp. Antwerp was critical to Allied victory because it was the fastest way to get supplies to the Western Front. But the port lay at the end of an 80-kilometer-long waterway. The shores of the Scheldt estuary were a stark, windswept and muddy landscape. The estuary was controlled by elite German emplacements, with lethal artillery dug in along the whole length of the coastline.
Each of those places was to be designated a fortress, was to receive a full German division and as much ammunition and supplies as they needed, with the clear objective of preventing the Allies from being able to use the ports along the Atlantic coast, because Hitler realized that the biggest single problem the Allies faced was logistics, was supplies.
the force was not really sufficient, and the conditions were very difficult to move through. And yet the battle itself was of the utmost importance. Clearing the approaches to Antwerp was recognized as a priority, and I'm a bit surprised that Montgomery and Eisenhower didn't see that this was something that had to be done as quickly as possible. But I suspect that everybody underestimated the ability of the Germans to defend the territory.
For any major assault, it is a military doctrine that the attackers should have 3 soldiers for every defender. The Canadians were nowhere near that.
At very best, the odds were 1-to-1, and I think, in fact, the Germans slightly outnumbered us, which suggests a very dangerous and difficult situation, which it turned out to be.
The Canadians were also fighting on terrain that they had never seen before. It was land that Holland had reclaimed from the sea. So there were dikes and polders, or flatlands, where the Dutch planted their crops. What's worse, the attack came in the fall during heavy rains.
I think the outstanding thing probably was mud. Everywhere you looked, there was mud, and it was all you could do in some places, even to walk.
I never had my shoes off, I think, in 2-3 months. And they were soaked about 4 or 5 times. It was not very pleasant.
In the morning, laying in a puddle of water in the field, there was no getting up in the morning. No getting up. The meal would come in the evening. Would be a warm meal of some kind. It's a miserable life. And the thing that you survive on is a good hot cup of coffee and maybe a shot of rum, you know. That's what helps you survive.
Fighting on this terrain was more than uncomfortable. It was lethal.
If you're on the road, you're in a ditch, it's half full of water. Or if you go out in the field, it's just mud and water. And you couldn't very well walk along the top of the dikes, because then you just become target practice.
The infantry knew that their only protection from enemy fire was to dig slit trenches.
In the Scheldt, the most that you could do is scrape out a little tiny thing to lie in or dig into the side of a dike. But since you, the Canadians, constantly need to attack, cannot stay dug in. You've got to get up and go over the dike, and you've got to get to the next polder, and you've got to use your artillery carefully to get there. And you do it when you're soaking wet and tired, and you've just lost one of your buddies in the last such encounter. So it really requires a kind of an almost impossible to understand commitment from the men to keep at fighting under those conditions.
We dig in because the Germans know we're there, and they have all guns set up on that spot. So they zero their weapons in on that spot because they know we're there. We just chase them out of there. So we always dig in because you're gonna get some flak coming back. So if you just stood around there, you wouldn't make it too far.
If you got up on the dikes, then like my buddy Bill Oakley, he got it right straight in the middle of the head with a sniper. We just kept on moving. we knew somewhere along the line it'll be over. Either you got one on the head, either that or you'd see at the end of the war.
But the Canadians faced a long and deadly road ahead before they could go home. For the Canadians, it was polder after polder, dike after dike, as far as the eye could see. Facing them was the German 15th Army, 90,000 strong, a formidable enemy. On the south side of the estuary, in the Breskins Pocket, the Germans held the waterways and the upper hand. Even flamethrowers couldn't dislodge them from the Leopold Canal. The Germans countered with terrifying results.
They had these things called moaning minis. Oh, they scared the hell out of you. They'd crank this thing up and then fire it off. And it just the awfulest noise. Just like 100 squeaking doors coming at you. And of course you'd hit the ground and hope for the best. So there was, a lot of scary things, but what the hell were you going to run? You're always afraid if you run back, some guy might shoot you. Your own guy.
The Canadians had to face relentless shelling.
I lost 3 vehicles, 3 Brent carriers, all from an 88. If you heard an 88 coming, you were safe, because you would be dead. You'd never hear it. That's that powerful and that fast.
And if German artillery didn't kill them, the Canadians would have to dodge the persistent firing of German machine guns.
My first officer, he said to me, he said, "Well, George, you stay with me." And I thought, I don't know if I want to or not, The German machine gun post opened up on us. And of course, the first reaction that you're supposed to, hit the ground. It's only common sense. Anyway, McCormick didn't hit the ground. And I'm laying there looking at him. And I could see these bullets ricocheting off his shovel. And I said, "For Christ's sake, get down." Well, he got down, because he got 2 in the back of the head.
The hurt was when somebody that you had been with for a number of weeks, months, or years got killed, and that's when it hurt. The ones you knew. The others, you learned to accept them as just one more statistic.
If the Canadians concentrated on a frontal attack alone, they would have been massacred. The man in charge of the campaign was Canadian General Guy Simonds. Simonds devised a deception which required amphibious vehicles called buffaloes. On October 9th, they launched the assault from the estuary.
It was an attempt to use the amphibious lift that they had as a result of these new vehicles, the buffaloes, the landing vehicles, tracked, and bring them in behind all of the German defenses over water through the Scheldt estuary into the back door of the Breskins Pocket, where the Germans had no defenses. And as a maneuver, it was highly successful. It caught the Germans completely by surprise, opened up a new bridgehead, and allowed them to build up and begin clearing the rest of the Breskins Pocket.
We landed about 2 or 3 in the morning on the Scheldt beach. Never had a shot fired at us. So it was a complete surprise to them. I guess they never dreamt anybody would come in from that way.
While the strategy was successful, the Germans put up a fierce fight. The Canadians took heavy casualties.
Many a time, a fella that was injured, his buddy, whoever, would throw his body over and make sure he wouldn't get any more.
I came close enough that I was wounded twice.
The wounded were driven back to a hospital. For the nurses, it was one heartbreak after another.
They came in all wet and soggy and so on top of being wounded. They were, you know, in not very good condition physically.
The wounds were gruesome.
Legs and arms that had to be amputated, wounds through and through, shot of the head, through and through wounds to the chest. Just massive wounds and terrible abdominal wounds. Young kids, you know, 18, 19, that have lost a leg and or an arm, or maybe both arms and both legs. That, you know, it was just dreadful. I guess it's because we were women. We had a different attitude, perhaps, towards the whole thing. One of pity and tenderness and concern about the men. They were always thankful. Even, you know, even for the smallest thing, they were grateful. The love of the men for each other was absolutely outstanding. Their greatest desire was to get back to their own regiment or whatever unit they belonged to and be with their own buddies. It was absolutely vital to them.
On the south side of the estuary, the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division finally pierced the German resistance. The job was just half done, though, and the deadliest part of the assignment was yet to come. On the north side of the Scheldt estuary, the 2nd Canadian Infantry Division faced the deadliest part of the mission. They had to advance 50 kilometers across the Bevland Peninsula, seize a narrow, heavily defended causeway, and capture the tip of the estuary, Walcheren Island. Militarily, the mission was virtually impossible.
What did I see? Well, all I saw a losing cause. We endeavored to get to that railway station because it had high ground there, and we just couldn't make it from one polder to the next polder, over the flats, to that creek. We couldn't get anything over that creek. There was one little tiny bridge like this, and that was laced with enemy guns.
They had everything gauged. They knew every piece of that field. They knew the exact distance from their mortars, and they could drop them right in your pocket. And it's the whole thing of having a field ranged in. If you are in an area in a sufficient time, and you know you're going to be holding that position later, you range in on every object so that your gunners can drop mortars wherever they want.
It was the sniper's job to try to create havoc.
You just laid there and watched with binoculars, just watching for any kind of movement. And when you saw movement, you'd identify it and try to see if it was something that would be repetitive or just some poor devil going out for a nature's call or something like that. And you would look after them.
The sniper's main targets were the officers.
If you see a group, look for the insignia.
or the man who, if no insignia is showing, the man whose head is moving or he's turning, he's looking or he's pointing, he's the senior man there. He's the officer. And you take him out, and you've terrorized the other guys that he's giving orders to. An ear shot or a forehead shot. Terrible to see your buddy go down, and you look down and there he is, and you said, my God, the guy's got a little skill. So the best thing you can do is duck for cover and not go out into that area until dark or until you figure it's safe. But you've denied them the use of certain areas just by the way you take somebody down.
But for each polder taken, the Canadians were paying with their lives. They fought a terrible battle of attrition near a small hamlet called Woensdrecht.
My friend Alec Duncan, he's right beside me. The shell lands between his legs, amputates both his legs. That's how close he was.
If somebody got wounded, depending on how bad it was, you got them to devil out of there. But somebody died, you shed a few tears. But nothing you could do about it. Nothing you could do about it. But we never left anybody behind, ever. And come the next day, you'll be burying a lot of your friends. We used to, you cut off the bottom dog tag and wrapped them in a blanket.
It's a nightmare. It's a nightmare. And I'll tell you, sir, I go to bed every night of my life. Every night. I think of my friends, both dead and alive.
For Wilkinson, Sanderson, and the soldiers of the Black Watch, that grim battle became known simply as Friday the 13th. The Black Watch suffered catastrophic losses, and almost every officer was killed or wounded. Even worse, it looked like the Canadians would never make it past the German defenses to their ultimate goal, Walcheren Island. Their mission seemed doomed.
We can't win the approaches to Walcheren Island because we simply don't have enough troops. We're fighting a battle of almost remarkable desperation there. There's a phrase in the 5th Brigade War Diary which says, I don't understand why they don't bring in more troops. If we don't do something, this will become a battle that will last all winter. One of the things that is most difficult to understand about the Scheldt campaign is where Canadians draw upon the reserves of courage, and maybe more important than courage is endurance, their ability to just keep going.
The Canadians desperately needed reinforcements. They weren't getting them because Montgomery was still infatuated with his plan to end the war by attacking Germany. Even though Operation Market Garden was a disaster.
It was really ill start from the beginning. The troops that they dropped across the Final River were simply not equipped to defend themselves for any length of time against significant force. I gather that they knew that there was an SS Panzer Grenadier Division regrouping about 20 kilometers further north, but things were so far gone that they decided to go ahead with the whole thing anyway. So those poor Englishmen found themselves up against not only battle-tested troops, but heavy armor as well.
The Canadians fighting on the Scheldt knew that Operation Market Garden was turning out badly.
Failure. Dead failure. There was the British, Poles, and Americans there, and if you happen to look at the cemeteries, you can see why it was a big failure. Mr. Montgomery, he wanted to be the hero of this war. He wanted to be Mr. War.
Supreme Allied Commander Dwight Eisenhower saw that Montgomery's plan, Market Garden, was a killing ground for the Allies. He ordered Montgomery to retreat and send his divisions to help the Canadians.
This was part of a growing quarrel between Eisenhower and Montgomery overstepped the boundary on October 15th in a letter to Eisenhower that questioned the whole legitimacy of Eisenhower's leadership. And the staff at SHAEF said, Eisenhower's had enough. He's going to fire you. We're at the stage where a major breach is going to occur. Montgomery wrote a really apologetic letter to Eisenhower the next day and said, Antwerp is the absolute priority. I'll get on with it right away.
As new troops joined the Canadians, the tide of battle turned. All that remained was to destroy the big guns of Walcheren Island. But crossing the causeway onto the island was yet another impossible mission.
It's like pouring water down a funnel. There was only one little hole to get, and that was the causeway. You couldn't bridge it any other way. I got up as far, I would have to say, within about 10 or 15 feet. And they started to machine gun me, and I jumped into a slit trench that happened to be there. And I said to myself, I'm here alone. I'm alone. How the hell can I fight this alone? And I withdrew back to the battalions, and they were a good piece back. They had to withdraw anyway. Everybody withdrew. The whole 5 Brigade withdrew.
Walcheren Island was a mean little spot out in the end of the Scheldt, and it had to be looked after. Fortunately, when we worked our way out there to take it, the Royal Navy and the Tactical Air Force, 2nd Tactical Air Force, moved in. And they blasted everything with rockets and opened up the dikes and flooded it.
Not only did the flooding immobilize the Germans, the island was now open to a well-orchestrated Allied attack from the sea. By November 8th, the Battle of the Scheldt was over. The price of victory was high, but the Canadians had overcome insurmountable odds, punishing terrain, and a fierce enemy. The port of Antwerp opened 3 weeks later. Allied troop carriers and supply ships could come and go without a shot fired upon them. But Holland was still under Nazi rule, and for the Dutch, the coming winter would be devastating. By the winter of 1944, the Dutch had lived in fear and terror under Nazi rule for nearly 5 years. The Dutch were deported to work camps. They were brutalized. They were hanged. They were shot. Their doors were kicked in. Their homes were ransacked. For the Jews, it was even worse. If they were caught, they were deported to death camps. Holland suffered more than any country in Western Europe.
Every Dutchman was threatened with the possibility that he had to go to Germany, especially younger people, but also some of the older men, all felt this possibility. Tomorrow, the day after, the Germans may call me to go to Germany and to work there in their factories or whatever. And then the people started to hide on a big scale. At the end of the war, I think about 300,000 people were hiding from the Germans.
And there was an enormous amount of terror. I've seen the terror with my own eyes. Each day, people were shot in the street, on the corners of the street. Resistance workers, but also innocent people.
The Jews in Holland faced never-ending danger. To stay alive, you always had to run and hide.
I was in my 18th dress with a farmer's family. Very kind people. And then all of a sudden there was a raid. And I was hidden in the closet. They searched the whole farm during 2 hours, and all the time I was in that closet. And very, very frightened, of course. But they didn't find me. They didn't find me. They left. And next morning they came back and went straight to that closet. So it was for sure that it was a matter of betrayal by somebody who was very familiar with the situation on the farm.
Jews survived the war because they were helped by Dutchmen. But we should not overestimate it. And when we are talking, when others are talking about the Dutch as the nation that were, as a whole, all the time busy saving the Jews, then we are talking about a myth. And you can see the story of Anne Frank. Anne Frank and her family were betrayed, and probably by a Dutchman. Who else could have done it?
So then they took me out, and I had to answer questions at gunpoint with a number of Germans and Dutch policemen. Asked if I was Jewish, and I said no. They took me to prison, and there I was questioned again and again and again. And I always repeated the same answer. Of course, they didn't believe one word. They threatened me, they were very intimidating, but I didn't change one word. And I stayed 2 months in that prison with 3 other people in one cell.
The winter was deadly. Food was scarce or non-existent.
January 45 was particularly cold. There were lots of people who just sat there and froze. And then, you had to go get your ration coupons, and it told you the rations themselves were steadily shrinking, down to, I think, something like 365 calories a day by the middle of April. But even then, the food wasn't available often to fill the rations, so people had to scrounge as best they could. I'm told, for example, that anybody who had a pet, a dog or a cat, kept it inside for the simple reason you allowed your pet to go outside, it would end up on somebody else's table.
In Amsterdam, you got the small streets, and they were packed with people waiting for food. And some of the people were fainting, and I left them open and went over their heads back to out of the lineup. And some of the people, well, they dropped dead on the street. They didn't survive.
Where all we would get is half a loaf of bread for a whole week, 3 or 4 potatoes for a whole week, and that little piece of butter that you get in your restaurant for your bun, that's what we got for the whole week. Yeah, for the rest there was none.
At one point, when there was hardly any food, people started to loot the stores for food. And I saw this young man, he was my age, I was 13 at the time, shot right in front of us and left there for us to, a warning, don't go near the stores and, don't do that.
On at least one occasion, things were so tight that we were forced to eat tulip bulbs, and that was a disagreeable experience.
No, they smell good. They smell like chestnuts, but we couldn't eat them. We couldn't eat them.
So many people, the old people, dying, and there was no way to transport them even to a place to bury them. So they piled them up in the churches. And then at night they went around with rattles to keep the rats away.
Over 25,000 people starved to death that winter. In the spring, the Dutch were hopeful that their 5-year nightmare would soon end. By March 1945, the Allies were ready to launch the final assault on Germany. Liberating Holland was left to the Canadians, but it wasn't going to be easy. The Germans ambushed Allied platoons and fired at them from their emplacements. Some of the fighting was house to house.
Just grab a grenade and pull the pin and throw it. And when they hear that particular twang when the lever lets go, they're going to duck their heads too, because they know what that sound is. And while they're ducking their heads, you're running. You're trying to find a place to get out of it.
Even as the Canadians drew closer, the Dutch were still desperate for food. Soon, American, British, and Canadian airmen would bring relief. Thanks to a temporary agreement with the German commanders.
When we returned from our last mission, we were taken aside and told that we would no longer carry on doing what we had been doing, but instead we would be used for something very, very different. Instead of carrying bombs, we'd be carrying food parcels, and we would be delivering them to Holland. Now, instructions had been given by the Germans that we should fly at a certain altitude, and that was about 1,000 feet, that we had to remain strictly on a course that they had obviously set aside for us. I was so enthused and so excited to think that suddenly we were doing something constructive. And when we finally got to where we were going, there we noticed several barns where they had used a very, very bold print to spell out the following: "Thank you, Canadians." Now that's very touching. that is very, very touching. Suddenly, throngs of people arrived, you know, and they were waving their banners, and they're waving their caps, and they're waving their handkerchiefs.
We were sitting on the side of the road in the field, and here came these planes, and they came in low, and they would wave at us, and they threw parcels out for us. We couldn't believe it. It was small parcels, and we opened it up, and what I do remember was in there was chocolate and crackers. And we just looked at each other, and we were crazy with joy.
And I can say this without hesitation. I know that there wasn't a dry eye in that whole plane when we returned day after day to see these people. Goodness, here they were starving. They were starving, literally. And here we were accommodating them to the point where suddenly they would get nourishment once again. Wonderful feeling.
The Canadians defeated the last pockets of German resistance by the first week of May. The campaign, started in the polders the autumn before, cost the lives of 7,600 Canadian troops. But Holland was free. Free to finally raise the Dutch flag and the orange standard of the royal family. The Dutch had waited so long for this moment, and they came out in their thousands to greet the Canadians.
It was May 7th, and it was a beautiful day. I'm sorry. I find it very... It's a day that I don't think I'll ever forget.
I thought, oh my God, here it comes. It's going to happen. We're going to be liberated. And it was quiet. Nobody said a word. And suddenly there was a big scream and yelling. And people went crazy. And they flew on the tank. And they embraced the soldier. I think at one point they took him out.
Everybody came, you know, that was able to come. And they brought us flowers and they brought us eggs. And everybody had something orange on for the House of Orange. The little girls had orange hair ribbons and the men had armbands of orange. And they were so joyful.
God, I don't know where all the people came from. They come out of the woodwork, and it was just amazing. They were so happy, and they were giving us all kinds of stuff to drink. And so we had food. They had lots of drink. And it was a great big party. Yeah.
You better believe it, we had parties there. Oh, yeah. Not only that they liberated us, but they brought food.
Then I remember the euphoria. Canadian tanks coming closer and closer. That was incredible. Yes, a moment of big happiness. Yeah. I tried to be as close as possible with the Canadian soldiers. We've got chocolate, peanuts, and I was allowed to hold a gun. I never forget that moment.
The arrival of the Canadian troops everywhere was greeted with this just incredible outburst of emotion, and even today, grandparents will tell grandchildren about what happened when the Canadians arrived, and the first time they saw this as making for a future.
You never forget those things. No, that's a scar. That's a big scar goes on the inside, and you'll notice a lot of veterans these days. If you see a memorial service or so, you'll see that tear in his eye, and he's thinking back of his buddies. He's thinking back of the problems he had.
We had 18,000 casualties go through our unit in 33 days, and we did 6,000 surgeries on those people. Now that'll give you some idea of quantity. Unbelievable.
We got the dirty job. I think the Canadians can raise their heads well high, because the tough part of the fighting in that whole war, the Second World War, is we got to give it to the Canadians.
And even for those who don't like war, who does, even those who think that militarism is somehow involved in telling war stories, the reality is these were our people. These were the young Canadians of that generation who went off to engage in the very difficult task of liberating Europe, and their life story deserves to be understood by all Canadians, deserves to be celebrated by all Canadians.